Welcome everyone. We began our journey through mystical material some time ago with a brief survey of various mystical themes and how they influenced Islamic traditions. From there, we proceeded to Muhammad specifically to look at how Muhammad dabbled with Merkaba mysticism. We looked at those fascinating stories of Muhammad and his contemporary Ibn Sayyad, the Jewish mystic with whom Muhammad competed. We saw there that Muhammad and Ibn Sayyad both exhibited some practices characteristic of divination. They would both, for example, wrap themselves in a garment or in a cloak in an attempt to induce a state of mystical contemplation, during which Muhammad, of course, hoped to receive some divine knowledge. Recalling that the Quran calls Muhammad the Cloaked One, we then turned our investigation to the Quran itself, where we saw that indeed some ancient mystical exegesis had been imported into the Quran as history, certainly a divine error by Allah. Every video I've mentioned so far is in the pinned comment. I'll leave it to you to catch up if you need to. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off and carry that Solomon and Queen of Sheba story a bit further. But when she saw it, that is the palace, she thought it was a body of water and uncovered her shins. Now this text should be familiar from our previous video on the topic. When we look at the second Targum of Esther, we see some interesting details added. You know the story well by now. Solomon heard that the Queen of Sheba was coming. He arose and sat in a glass house. The Queen of Sheba saw that he was sitting in a glass house and thought that he was sitting in water. So she lifted up her robe to wade across, and Solomon saw that she had hairy legs. Solomon responded by saying to her, "You are exceedingly beautiful as a woman, but your hair is the hair of a man." Now what we're going to see in this video is something that we've seen over and over and over and over again. Please watch my video, How Islam Shaped Its Sources, if you want more specific examples of how Muslims would take over prior existing narratives and shape them to suit their purposes. They made up history or changed history to suit their theological tastes. Jacob Lasner says it well. Thus, the story of the ancient Israelites, the episode of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba included was a history that Muslims appropriated and refashioned to suit their own historic consciousness and worldview. That Muslims hijack history and make it their own is blatantly obvious to everyone except for Muslims. Now, both the Quran and the second Targum of Esther leave out critical details necessary for understanding the story. Christopher Morey Jones draws the natural conclusion. These considerations indicate that the second Targum of Esther and the Quran are both alluding to a traditional story, which is assumed to be familiar to the reader. Since both of these sources were probably written during the 7th century, the story itself must be older still. Now, of course, you notice that very conspicuous feature of the Queen of Sheba that we looked at earlier. She had hairy legs. Indeed, Solomon said, "Your hair is the hair of a man." But does this detail show up in Muslim sources too? It sure does, and in doing so, it provides further support that both the Quran and the Targum are relying on an earlier folktale. In most early Muslim commentaries on the passage, this detail is an integral part of the tale. So let's read such an example from an 11th century Islamic commentator. The queen walks into the palace. She thinks part of it is water. She lifts up her robe to keep it from getting wet. And Al-Talibi tells us she had the most beautiful ankles and feet that any human could have, but her ankles were most certainly hairy. So this really attractive queen, but she has hairy ankles. What do you do? Solomon didn't know. He asked the jinns. The jinns didn't know. Then he asked the Satans. The Satans, fortunately, had a wonderful idea. They found a way to mix some chemicals together to remove the leg hair. The tafsir continues. Ibn Abbas related that was the first time a depilatory was used. Solomon then married her. Ibn Abbas, such a wise man. When demonstrably unhistorical stories show up in the Quran, some Muslims will back up and say, but it's a symbolic interpretation. So what would the interpretation be? What would the meaning of such a narrative be to these early Muslim commentators? Well, in part, it became a story about the subjugation of women, especially those who step outside of their gender roles and assume a position of leadership. Remember what Solomon said, "Your hair is the hair of a man." The queen wasn't supposed to be in charge. She was a woman with manly characteristics, and the hairiness of her legs was one way of communicating that she had crossed gender boundaries, just as, birthed from her jinn mother, she had crossed ontological boundaries. So again we ask, what is the purpose of this narrative? It seems to be about gender boundaries. Presumably, the gender-related issues that link Muslim and Jewish sources were so powerful and spoke so directly to the Muslim concerns that they became central to the larger Islamic saga of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Be that as it may, the theological agenda of the Quranic text and the need to Islamicize the ancient history of the Jews creates a parallel story requiring a second explication of the text. Since the Quran leaves the event so inadequately narrated, as always, it certainly does beg interpretation, and interpretation is what it got. The meaning of the queen's hairy legs is not difficult to understand. They are symbolic of her wild and untamed masculine nature and of her arrogation of the male prerogatives of rulership and power. In a woman, according to these writers, such qualities are repugnant, no matter how desirable she otherwise may be. Perhaps the purpose of this story is Allah teaching that a woman ruler crosses gender boundaries and must be subjugated. I think Muhammad would agree. When the Queen of Sheba was mentioned to him, he said, "No society prospers that allows a woman to rule over them." But some Muslims might object that this isn't in accordance with the teaching of the Quran. Allah treats men and women equally. But I would like to ask, does it really? Is there any hint in the Quran of favoritism of men over women? Is there any hint of anti-woman bias or misogyny in the Quran? Yes, there is. There's more than a hint. There is an explicit trajectory of anti-woman bias that weaves its way through the text of the Islamic Holy Scripture. Call in 2 of your men as witnesses, and then referring to sons as witnesses. If there are not 2 men, then a man and 2 women. Verses like this make one wonder why women aren't mentioned, or if they are, they're clearly inferior to men. In other cases, the silence on women is deafening. God has given you sons and grandsons. What about daughters? On Judgment Day, one will flee from his brother, mother, and father, his consort, and his sons. And when daughters are mentioned, the Quran clearly prefers sons over them. What's the proof for that? Well, let's start with angels, who in the Quran are called daughters of God. This is what we see, for example, in Surahs 16 and 17. They assign daughters to God, or a rhetorical question: has your Lord distinguished you with sons and taken for himself females from the angels? So you can see the problem here. In calling angels the daughters of Allah, Allah is offended. Do the believers have sons while Allah has daughters? This question is repeated several times. Does Allah have daughters while you have sons? Do you have male offspring while Allah has female? Has Allah chosen daughters over your sons? Has Allah taken daughters and singled you out with sons? Perhaps this is why you have boys in paradise. No one wants those daughters. Among the believers in paradise will circulate boys of their own, boys of eternal youth, and Allah will increase you with wealth and sons. So things go from bad to worse. Not only have we seen this story about Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba gives us an example of a historical error in the Quran, but it also gives us the example of a story that lended itself to a certain interpretation among early Muslim commentators. That interpretation was effectively about the subjugation of women and how inappropriate it was for the Queen of Sheba to step outside of her gender role and become a ruler. What was a story of international politics in the Bible became a story of gender politics in the Quran. Not only that, but we saw that Allah himself in the Quran prefers sons against daughters, both in this life and in the hereafter. Thanks for watching.